days. If you don't hear me, raise your hand and I'll talk louder. And then we will have a Q&A at the end of the performance or the end of the presentation. That wine had its effect. And if anybody has a burning question while I'm talking, raise your hand. We'll answer it right there. This is a casual operation. It's not formal. I don't mind an interruption and get the issue settled right on the spot. And then finally, anything I say today is unclassified. I've been 40 years out of the Navy. I'm completely out of touch with current naval operations. I got my latest information that I might be referring to in the talk off the internet, so I know that everything is unclassified. Now, as Peter said, I was a naval officer in the Korean War, and by virtue of earlier work on what's now called nuclear technology, I got assigned to the top management group that was organizing and running the design and building of the first Navy nuclear submarine, the Nautilus. I spent about 6 years with that group, from the launching of that submarine through her fitting out and sea trials, and some follow-on work with follow-on classes of submarines, surface ships, leading up to the Polaris boat that carried our major missiles with the nuclear warheads. Can you hear me okay? Right closer, is that better?
That's much better.
I'll try to keep it right up as close as I can. Keep reminding me I'm not used to it, and I'll have to do the best I can. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is submarines, which go way back to the turn of the century and have carried right on up to today with the modern means of propulsion. A submarine is basically a naval vessel that's designed to operate underwater. And the primary consideration of a submarine, as was just mentioned, is stealth. No one is supposed to know where the submarine is, how it got there, where it's going to go, how long it's going to stay. Stealth is a primary requirement. The sailing orders that the commander of any submarine gets as he takes off on a cruise, the first sentence in every sailing order he reads is the same. It says, "Remain undetected." And then it goes on and tells him what he's supposed to do in that particular cruise. So the essence of submarines is that they should operate in a way that nobody knows where they are. And yet, the submarine, before nuclear power came along, was really very much of a surface-oriented vessel, in spite of the fact that it was intended to operate underwater. Let's get the... I'll have to click the slides. How can I do? I need 3 hands here. Let me have my click. Where did I put it? Up, okay. Here's a classic submarine.
Microphone.
Can't hear you.
Here's a classic submarine. And here's the characteristics of a classic submarine. The primary consideration in submarines is that it has 2 methods of propulsion, one for on the surface, one for when it's underwater. On the surface, it operates with diesel engines, and it can go quite well. It can go 15 knots. On a single refueling, it can go as far as 15,000 miles. And just for comparison, from LA to Honolulu is about 2,700 miles. From Honolulu to Tokyo, about 3,800 miles. From Honolulu to the North Pole, about 4,700 miles. So when we talk 15,000 miles, we're talking a considerable distance on a single refueling. However, underwater, the submarine, the conventional submarine, is severely limited. Her submerged operation underwater, 1 hour at 9 knots. Limited endurance. She operates on battery-powered electric motors, and in typical submarine operation, they surface at night and they charge the battery. The ship will move around on one engine and move to where she has to go. The other engine is charging the batteries. Come the dawn, the submarine submerges and stays underwater while daylight is there. When daylight goes away, she can operate on the surface and be undetected. Now, nuclear propulsion is significantly different. It's revolutionary in the sense that It allows the submarine to be truly submersible. Nuclear propulsion, the technique of nuclear propulsion does not require combustion, does not generate exhaust gases, does not utilize oxygen. It is completely self-contained. And it allows a submarine, a nuclear submarine, the surface propulsion is nuclear, the submerged propulsion is nuclear. There's so much energy generated, she can go significantly faster than a classic boat. The nuclear submarine operates by utilizing the nucleus of the atom. It was determined, Einstein actually developed the idea in 1914. It was demonstrated in 1939 with fission by experimentation in Germany, and it was culminated in a practical application in 1945 with the atomic bomb. And we are utilizing the same principle as the atomic bomb in operating a nuclear submarine, except we're not doing it all at once. We're doing it over a period of time where we generate heat rather than a big explosion. And the heat that we generate in the nuclear reactor is carried away to make steam, and that steam then runs the machinery that runs the ship. And because we have so much energy available, we can operate that ship faster than a conventional submarine. We can go deeper, and we can stay out submerged longer. So today's nuclear submarines can leave port, go underwater, disappear, stay out there for as long as 3 months. They stay out as long as there's food and crew morale available to keep everybody happy. And typically that might be 3 months. Some of the boats have stayed out for 6 months. And they can go, the point about, let me talk about knots for a minute, just in case anybody isn't familiar. A knot is a nautical term, a nautical way of expressing miles per hour, a way of expressing speed. So 10 knots is 10 miles per hour, except it's nautical miles. Nautical miles are about 15% longer than land miles. So when I say 10 knots, I mean 10 nautical miles per hour. That's 11 and a half land miles per hour. When I say 20 knots, that's 22.2 land miles per hour. And as far as ship speeds are concerned, which are usually 10 knots, 20 knots, 30 knots, relatively slow speeds, you can just convert from land miles to nautical miles with no problem. If I say 10 knots, just think 10 miles per hour. 20 knots, just think 20 miles per hour. Let it go at that. Now, the only other thing I want to mention about nuclear propulsion, beside it providing unlimited range and speed for a submarine, is safety. When we initiated the design of the nuclear submarine, the nuclear power plant, one of the primary considerations was that it be safe, that you could stand next to the operating nuclear power plant and get no more radiation than you would get if you stood on the ground in the baseball field in Dodger Stadium looking at the sun. Any one of us walking around the earth gets radiation from the earth, residual radiation from the minerals in the earth, and some radiation coming down from the sun. And the human body has adjusted to that over evolutionary time, so we're basically immune to that level of radiation. And our intent in designing and building submarines is to not allow the radiation that's an offshoot of operating a nuclear power plant be any greater than the radiation you get from normally walking around on the Earth. And we have operated nuclear boats in the U.S. Navy for something like 6,200 reactor years. We haven't had a single nuclear accident. We've operated 128 million miles, and there hasn't been a single nuclear accident. So nuclear safety is a primary consideration in designing and building new boats, and to date there has not been any problem in terms of nuclear accidents hurting or killing individuals. Now, let me see. I want to go a little bit into history of submarines before I talk about how we got. I want to tell you how we got into nuclear power, what the issues were about moving into that direction. There's an awful lot of objection, an awful lot of jealousy, an awful lot of resentment, an awful lot of discrimination, and just plain meanness. But in spite of that, the people who were involved in getting that nuclear program underway succeeded, and we've done quite well. Let me see about getting beyond this section now into the next picture. What do we got now? Yeah. This man here, this is John Holland. This man can be called the father of the Navy. I'm talking now 1880. John Holland was born in 1844 in Ireland. He studied engineering, he taught math. He came to America in 1878. He was an Irish patriot. He wanted to separate Ireland from Britain. He felt a great deal of umbrage against the harsh treatment the Irish were receiving by the British. He wanted to sink the British fleet. He thought if he could sink the fleet, he could effect the separation of Ireland from Britain. And he came to America. He tied up with the Fenian Brothers Society, which was a group of Irishmen, Irish patriots, founded about 1858, set up with the intent of encouraging the separation of Ireland from Britain. He tied up with them in New Jersey, 1888, 1890. They financed his development of what he called this vessel. This is a submarine, a submersible. He called it the Fenian Ram. His intent was to make 24 of these ships. They're about 30 feet long. They're powered by steam engines. They have a torpedo at the front end. The torpedo was invented in 1890 by an Englishman named Whitehead, and it was worldwide in use early before World War I and World War II, quite well known. He took that torpedo and put it in the front of his Fenian Ram. He wanted to make 24 of those rams, put them on a commercial vessel, take them over to Britain to the harbor where the British fleet was anchored. He wanted to launch those vessels underwater and penetrate the hull of every British naval vessel and sink it. That was his intent. He had the backing of the Fenian Brothers Society. However, he got cross-threaded with them, and they only financed the development of one. And he couldn't get financing for any more. And he talked to the U.S. Navy about submarine concepts. He designed several various submarines. And actually, the Navy bought one of his submarines. Here it is. This is the USS Holland. This is SS number 1, the first submarine the Navy commissioned in the Navy in 1900. It's 30 feet long. It'll go to a depth of 59 feet. It operates gasoline engines on the surface, battery-powered electric motor underneath, and it was the first naval submarine brought into the fleet. He really didn't do much after that. In fact, he got sick pretty badly, and he died about 1915. But there was a second man in America. Oh, one other thing. The people that built the SS Holland in New Jersey, in the shipyard, the Crescent Shipyard, that shipyard evolved into the Electric Boat Company. They moved up to Groton, Connecticut, and they became the #1 builders of submarines in the United States. They still exist. They're part of General Dynamics today. But through World War II, through World War I and World War II, they were the #1 builder of submarines for the U.S. Navy. Now, the second man that was major in terms of developing submarines for the Navy was Simon Lake. He was born about 1866. He was also a New Jersey resident. He developed a significant number of benefits for submarines. He has 200 patents on ballast tanks, on periscopes, on diving planes, on equipment associated with operating submarines. He designed a submarine for the Navy that the Navy bought in 1916 called the Plunger. And the reason I bring this up, the first naval officer in charge of this vessel was Ensign Chester W. Nimitz. Many of you may know Admiral Nimitz as commander of the Pacific Fleet in World War II. Chester Nimitz started out in the Navy as early as 1910 and became in charge of one of the first submarines the Navy operated in World War I. Now, following following the activities of Lake. Lake died about 1945. He was active in dealing with submarine technology in the Navy through World War I and World War II. But the Navy wasn't too excited about submarines in World War I. The Germans really took the technology away and developed the U-boat. And the U-boat was significant in blockading Britain and almost bringing Britain to her knees and causing her to lose World War I. They also attacked major ocean liners. This is the Lusitania, which it was really a British-owned liner, but sailed between America and Britain. And in something like May 1915, she took off from New York with the intent of sailing to Liverpool. She was sunk by a German submarine within 11 miles of Liverpool in the Irish Sea between Ireland and Britain. 1,100 people were lost. An awful lot were Americans. There was quite a to-do raised in America about the fact that the Germans had sunk this vessel. Woodrow Wilson was president. He was kind of reluctant to cause a problem because he had a very large number of German-American citizens in America. The largest minority in America was German, the majority being British, but the largest minority was German, and Wilson just didn't want to upset the apple cart relative to dealing with that fraction of the population in May 1915. However, in January 1917, something came along called the Zimmermann telegram, which was a message the German Foreign Office sent to Mexico, suggesting that Mexico align itself with Germany, declare war on the U.S., invade Texas and Arizona, and take them back from us when we took them from them in the Mexican War in 1845. Well, the Zimmermann telegram was enough of a provocation to cause the United States to declare war on Germany, join the Allies. The war was declared April 1917. The war was over 1918, and we won, and things went as they did. The Navy really wasn't too much involved in submarine development through World War I, or really through the years of the 1920s and the 1930s. The airplane was really the dominant technical feature. Guys like General Doolittle, Charles Lindbergh, they were far more in terms of generating popularity for the aircraft. There was a convention in Washington, D.C. in 1922, the Washington Naval Convention, attended by Japan, by America, by Britain, by France, Germany, Belgium, Holland, that settled on the size of battleships, how many battleships would be in each country's fleet, what size of gun they would use, and they also determined that submarines would have a secondary scouting action rather than an attack activity. So submarines were sort of relegated to a scouting activity rather than an attack activity as a result of that convention. And come the start of World War II, we had what we called a fleet submarine. I think I've got a picture of it here. This is our fleet submarine, and the characteristics of this, let's get them up here. There it is. She was about 310 feet long, 27-foot beam. She could go 12,000 miles at 20 knots on the surface at a top speed of 20 knots. Submerged, she could go 10 knots for the order of maybe 2 hours, and her crew was 85. She carried torpedo tubes as an armament and 2 deck guns at that time, and her depth was listed in Jane's Fighting Ships, which is a compendium of Navy ships around the world, Jane's Fighting Ships. They called the depth of our submarines as 300 feet. Actually, our boats could go 400 feet. But the Japs read Jane's Fighting Ships. They set their depth charges for 300 feet, and they consistently missed our boats when they depth charged our boats through the entire war. Now, the other point I want to make about World War II, the primary activity in this country was dealing with Europe, but once Europe was dealt with, we turned to the Pacific. We really only had 2 surface naval battles in the Pacific in World War II, the Coral Sea very early in 1942, where we defeated the Japanese fleet and knocked out 15 vessels. And Midway, which was very important, it was about April 1942, we thought we had broken the Japanese naval code and could understand the messages sent by Jap headquarters to the various ships. And we tested that at the Battle of Midway by sending our fleet to where we thought the Japanese would be. And we were correct. And we won the Battle of Midway. We knocked out 10 more Japanese capital ships and basically defeated the surface fleet of Japan for the rest of the war. For the rest of the war, our surface navy was supporting the troop movements, the troop landings in the various islands, starting with Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, and so on. Now our submarines had a different mission. We had something like 24 submarines in Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was bombed. We had about 29 in Manila, where we had another naval activity in the Philippines. But our submarines were on maneuver when the Japs bombed Pearl Harbor, and they weren't hurt. We were able to pull those submarines out of Pearl Harbor. We pulled the submarines out of Manila. The Japs didn't get into Manila until about 3 days after they bombed Pearl Harbor. We pulled those roughly 50 submarines down to Perth, Australia. I think I have a map. Well, you can't see that. Take my word for it. We pulled our submarine fleet of roughly 50 submarines down to Perth, Australia, and we operated our submarine fleet sort of independent of the rest of the Navy, attacking and harassing Japanese ships, cargo ships, troop ships, and whatnot in the Western Pacific and in the homeland waters of Japan. And we had the benefit of having broken the Japanese code. We could set these submarines out into various zones around the Western Pacific. We could send a message from Pearl Harbor every morning telling the ships about troop movements, ship movements, and so on. The ships could place themselves accordingly and sink the appropriate targets. Over the time that we're talking from roughly the middle of 1942 till the end of the war in 1945, we sunk 1,100 merchant ships, 240 military ships that significantly contributed to the defeat of Japan in World War II. We lost about 52 submarines, 3,500 men. Now, basically that was the submarine activity in World War II, was harassing and affecting damage on the supply system of Japan in operating its Navy and its Army. Now here we are, at the end of World War II, it's the atomic bomb. The Army had the job of developing the atomic bomb. The Army engineers set up a program called the Manhattan Project. Actually, it all began with Einstein. Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt in 1939. Actually, Einstein was visited by two physicists from Hungary who were citizens in America at that time, two atomic physicists, Eugene Wigner and Leo Szilard, who were well known in the physics world as top-notch physics people. Szilard actually had conceived the idea of the atomic bomb conceptually, theoretically, way back in 1933. And he and Wigner talked to Einstein and they said, listen, Albert, Roosevelt will listen to you. You've got to write him a letter. You've got to tell him that the Nazis have an awful lot of uranium they got out of a mine in Czechoslovakia, and they're working on what could well be a nuclear explosive, an atomic explosive as they called it in those days. So Einstein, they wrote a letter and Einstein signed it. Roosevelt received it. He acted on it. He had a group called the NRDC, the Research and Development Council. They took a look at what was written. They formed a subcommittee called the Uranium Committee, and they decided that they really should look into utilizing uranium as a potential explosive and they would do the research and see what happened. They decided they would set the Army engineers as the group directing the project. These are the people, that man, third from the right, the Army guy, third from the right, the second from the right is General Groves. He was in charge of it. The two civilians there are part of the group that advised Roosevelt. That's Vannevar Bush and Jim Conant. Bush was out of MIT. Conant was out of Harvard. And the man on the far right was the man that was in charge of building the nuclear facility in Hanford that made the plutonium that was dropped on the bomb in Nagasaki. But these people were instrumental in getting the atomic bomb built. And once that was done, Groves was thinking about what other military applications are possible for atomic energy. And he finally concluded that the best application could be Navy. In the naval propulsion would be the best application of nuclear energy over anything the Army could do or the Air Force could do. And actually, in 1939, when fission was first promulgated, first realized, and some papers were written, the Naval Research Laboratory read some of these papers, and a physicist in the Naval Research Laboratory named Philip Abelson wrote a paper on how atomic energy could be used to propel nuclear submarines in 1939. The war started, and they put that on the shelf. They didn't worry about it. They put their mind to more important issues. But there was someone in the Bureau of Ships. The Bureau of Ships is the part of the Navy that's responsible for designing and building the warships in the Navy. The head man of the Bureau of Ships, and we got his picture coming up. Here he is, Admiral Mills. Admiral Mills had read that document from the Naval Research Lab. He was running the Bureau of Ships during the war, and he recognized the value of nuclear propulsion as a way of improving the way submarines could operate once the war was over. He got working with Groves, and let's see what we have next here. Okay, they concluded that it might be a good idea to set up a branch in the Bureau of Ships called the Nuclear Power Division of the Bureau of Ships and take a look at designing what it would take to design a propulsion plant for running a submarine. At the same time, in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the man in charge of, the man that ran the part of Oak Ridge, Tennessee that developed the techniques for separating uranium fuel leading to the bomb, decided that a lot of that technology should be made available to American industry. Dr. Alvin Weinberg. He set up the Orsort School, Oak Ridge School of Reactor Technology. He invited American industrial engineers and people from the government to attend for 1 year to take courses in the technology associated with developing the atomic bomb and utilizing that technology for whatever applications they had in mind. At the same time, this was a very busy year, 1946, the Congress set up the Atomic Energy Commission, taking control of the development of future atomic bombs away from the Army and giving it to the civilians. The Atomic Energy Commission was established in 1946. David Lilienthal was the key man. All of this happening in 1946, and Admiral Mills concluding that he was going to send 5 naval officers to the Orsort School to get familiar with nuclear technology. Now, he considered the key man should be a really sharp cookie. He concluded that should be a man called Hyman G. Rickover, Commander Rickover at that time. Commander Rickover was born in Poland, 1900, came to America with his family, his brother, his mother, his father. 1906, they settled in Chicago. His father was a tailor, and as a tailor, he got to know the congressman. Rickover at the time ran that bureau in such a way, he generated one heck of a lot of agitation, a heck of a lot of resentment, but he got the American industry to provide the Navy with the proper sort of equipment that we needed to make our ships operate properly during the war. And as the war progressed and we began to get toward the end of it, Mills assigned him to Okinawa to set up a repair base to take care of ships that might be damaged during our invasion of Japan. And he was putting that repair base together in Okinawa when the bomb dropped, and we all just didn't know what to do next. We didn't expect the war to end so soon. And he came back to America, and that was the time when Mills and Groves and the people in the new AEC were considering setting up a program to develop a nuclear-powered propulsion plant for use in a submarine. And then Captain Rickover was assigned to be the key man in running that program. Now, while he was at that Orsart school, he got to know an awful lot of American industrial executives, and in particular, he got to know people in Westinghouse. Charlie Weaver was the head man in Westinghouse. Westinghouse got the project for designing the nuclear plant, the first nuclear plant. An electric boat company in Groton got the contract for building the ship at that time. And that all happened about 1948, something like that. And let me check a few dates here now. Let's see where we are. Okay. That's the next picture. Okay. One of the features of designing a power plant for a submarine would be to build a prototype, which would allow them to put equipment into a configuration similar to how it would be in the submarine, do a lot of testing, make changes, and not worry about the fact that they're dealing in the ocean and things like this. They wanted to build a prototype, and at the same time, the Atomic Energy Commission decided that they should have a nuclear test facility somewhere in the country which would be safe as far as citizens are concerned, but could have some problems occurring, some explosions or whatever. And they selected an area in southeastern Idaho, about 500 square miles of ground, which was covered with nothing but lava flows. Arklow, Idaho, you may know of it. And the National Reactor Test Station was set up there, and Rickover's people built the first prototype of a submarine in that facility. This picture here, I think I have a little thing here. You can see a circular pool about 100 feet in diameter of water with about 30 feet deep, and here is the center of the hull of the submarine, right here, about 35 feet in diameter and about maybe 100 feet in length. And that was used to contain the equipment that would run the first nuclear submarine. A lot of testing was done there, a lot of training that actually ran at full power for 6 days and demonstrated the fact that it could do that. The power that was generated there was taken out in a shaft at the end of that picture and used in a water break to just use up the energy. And that prototype ran through the 1980s as a testing and training facility. Now, the Nautilus itself, the keel was laid in 1954, I believe. Harry Truman's in that picture. I don't know if you see him there. Harry Truman is signing his name on the keel plate of that submarine.
Hold the mic closer to your mouth.
Harry Truman is signing his name down there. There's his name. He actually used a welding torch and signed his name with a welding torch as a ceremony for the keel laying of the Nautilus. And in 1954, she was launched. The Navy wanted Mrs. Eisenhower to christen the boat, and there was quite a to-do, because about 2 or 3 days before the ship was to be launched, the Washington Post issued a column written by a pundit that indicated that this whole Nautilus thing was just an experimental ship. There wasn't anything really going to happen with it. The Navy was just fooling around to test out the application of nuclear power and didn't really expect to go anywhere with it. And Eisenhower didn't want to have Mamie launch an experimental ship. And it took Charlie Wilson, who was Secretary of Defense, to go there with Rickover to the Oval Office and convince Eisenhower that this really was a wartime vessel. This ship had torpedo tubes. This ship was a wartime vessel. And Mamie launched her throwing a champagne bottle and so on. I think I've got a picture of the launching. Here she is. Yeah. And she was launched in 1954. Now, this man here is Dennis Wilkinson. He was the skipper of this submarine. He was the first skipper selected to run the first nuclear-powered boat. Dennis is a California guy. He graduated at USC. He majored in physics. He taught school. He joined the Navy in World War II. He worked on. He served on submarines, but he never commanded one. He just didn't. He just wasn't old enough to do that, and he didn't go to the academy. And the Admiral didn't want an academy graduate to be the key man on the first nuclear boat. The Admiral wanted this part of the Navy to be an ordinary part of the Navy, not something elite, not something special. And he felt that if he could get people to run this part of the Navy who were ordinary people, things would work out better. And Wilkinson fit that mold very well. He was a very easy man to get along with. In 1955, they had her sea trials. Here she is on her sea trial. She did those sea trials in 2 days. Nothing went wrong. She worked perfectly, except for some minor details. And she ultimately joined the fleet and operated with the fleet as the first nuclear-powered submarine. And there's one story I want to tell about that. 6 months or so after she was operating, they were doing some maneuvers with an aircraft carrier and a screen of destroyers outside Newport, off in the waters south of the Chesapeake Bay. And here's this screen of destroyers surrounding this aircraft carrier. And Wilkinson brings his boat underneath the screen, comes up behind the carrier, gets directly behind the carrier about 30, 40 feet, about 10 feet below the surface. He takes some photographs of the propellers of the carrier through his periscopes, submerges back down, goes out, goes away. The next morning he walks into the Chief of Naval Operations, lays down these photographs showing that his boat was right behind that carrier. He could have torpedoed that carrier, no problem. And that really was solid proof that nuclear propulsion in submarines was the way to go. It really made the story for nuclear power in submarines. And let's see where we are. Now, what do we got here? That's the Seawolf. Let me tell you about the Seawolf. The Seawolf was the second ship considered for nuclear power. The AEC is a very conservative organization. Anybody who built the bomb was very conservative. They had evolved 4 theoretical ways of making the explosive material that constituted the bomb, and they pushed all 4 mechanisms, all four methods during the war, and 2 of them were better than the other 2, and those 2 were used to make the actual bomb material that was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And the AEC thought that maybe we should have a backup to the Nautilus and a whole submarine concept that was different in theory, but still would produce the same result. And General Electric, who competes with Westinghouse in a lot of electrical power areas, was working sort of independently, although in connection with the AEC, on looking at a nuclear concept that could ultimately go into civilian electric power generation. And through a bit of cajoling and arm twisting and whatnot, GE was persuaded to drop that work on designing a civilian power plant and turn it into a second submarine. And they worked on the Seawolf. The Seawolf would use a different coolant. The The Nautilus used water as the coolant. The water would take the heat from the core of the nuclear reactor, carry the heat to a steam generator, and generate steam. The Seawolf would take the heat from the nuclear core, but use liquid sodium, which could run at a higher temperature, significantly higher temperature, about 200 degrees, about 800 degrees rather than 600 degrees. And what this meant was that the whole plant for the Seawolf could be smaller, more efficient, and could use steam at a higher pressure. It could use superheated steam rather than saturated steam, such as we had in the Nautilus. And the Seawolf moved along in that direction. I want to show you this man. You may recognize this man as Jimmy Carter. We were sitting in Washington, D.C. in the offices one day, and it was after hours, and we were talking, and we had some women who were our secretaries, but there was one secretary who was a yeoman who was from the fleet, assigned from the fleet to work for our group. He came running down the hall, all excited, and he said, "Someone is leaving the program, some guy named Carter." And we weren't sure who that was, because he was assigned to Schenectady and we were in Washington. But this was Jimmy Carter. And Jimmy Carter was considering leaving the program to take over a peanut farm. It turns out Jimmy's family had settled in southwestern Georgia, Sumner County, in 1850, and they had a big spread, a big farm, and they took care of all the farms around in terms of taking in the crops, processing the material, packaging and distributing. It was a very big operation. Jimmy's father ran it. Jimmy's father died unexpectedly. Jimmy had joined the Navy in 1940, had gone to the academy, was 11 years in submarines, had volunteered for the work with Rickover's people, and was assigned as the engineering officer for the Seawolf, a very important consideration. He had one tough time deciding that he should retire from the Navy and leave that, resign from the Navy actually, and take over the family farm. His wife didn't want him to do that, but he ultimately did. And he shocked the pants off everybody as a result of that, but he went successfully from there on out. But there was a significant effect. We had to put a new person in running the boat. Ultimately, that ship was launched and sailed. She sailed for 2 years with the sodium coolant, but we had the same problem they had at San Onofre, if you remember. They had problems with superheaters. We had the same problem on this boat here. The superheaters just leaked. They would not work properly, and the ship was limited in its operation to about 80% of what it could do. She ran for about 2 years, and then they pulled her back into the shipyard. They pulled out that sodium plant, and they put in a Nautilus-type plant, and that ship ran with a water-cooled nuclear reactor for 30-some-odd years and did quite well. So she, in the ultimate end, she did fine. And what she really did was prove that a water-cooled reactor would be the best technology to use, and every naval ship we've had from there on out operates on that same technical basis. Now, where are we at now? That's actually the launching of the... if I have a minute, I'll tell you another story about this. My wife gets a kick out of this one. I was at this launching in Groton, Connecticut, and it was the General Dynamics had just taken over Electric Boat Company about 3 months before, and the head man, the chairman of the board, John Hopkins, was at the platform where they would throw the bottle of champagne and launch it. And up there was a lady who would throw the champagne bottle, Mrs. Sterling Cole. She was the wife of the head man in the Joint Committee of Atomic Energy. Very key person as far as funding the Navy's programs were concerned. And that man's wife was nominated to launch this ship. They're chatting away down there. We're down at the bottom, and we realize the ship is moving and they're still talking. She throws the bottle and it misses. And the ship starts sliding down the ways. And it hasn't been launched. But the Navy has a backup. We had our project manager on board Bob Sweek, he had a little lanyard. He got the signal that she didn't break the bottle. He pulled the lanyard, and a second bottle came down and broke with the champagne before the ship hit the water. And then later on, that was done in the morning, 10 o'clock or so. Later on, about 12, 1 o'clock, we're all at this luncheon. She's at the head table, and they bring her this broken bottle, as if she had broken the goddamn bottle. Amazing. But that ship was a Jonah. I mean, that ship ran very well, and I knew the skipper quite well, Dick Lanning, but the superheater problem was one that nobody could just solve. It still is a problem today. It just is a question of where the tubes in the superheater join what's called a tube sheet, and the thermal stresses are such that that joint just won't stand up, and the sodium leaks out into the steam side of the plant, and the sodium is radioactive, and it's a hazard to the operators, and the ship just has to take care of that by going back into port and cleaning up. So it was a limit on the ship's operation. And after 2 years, we just gave up and pulled out the whole plant and put in an Nautilus type plant, and she worked quite well from there on out. Now, a couple of other points about this operation. All this time, the Admiral is, Rickover had gone from commander to captain to rear admiral, and ultimately he became vice admiral. Every step of the way was one tough problem. A lot of the Navy was very resentful of the conversion to nuclear power. They thought, well, submarines, what the hell, it's a scouting vessel, who cares about that? But when we started talking about putting nuclear power on surface ships, we began to run into a wall of resentment. And it took Congress to order the Navy to make Rickover an admiral. If he didn't make the admiral, he would be obliged to retire. That was mandatory in the way Navy regs were set up. He became initially a rear admiral, then a vice admiral, again by the command of Congress. Every step of the way was a significant battle. We actually had a design underway for a surface ship, for an aircraft carrier. And there was an issue in an aircraft carrier where steam is used to catapult the aircraft. You launch the aircraft with a steam-driven catapult, and you draw a big chunk of steam out of the steam plant when you do that, and the Bureau of Aeronautics, not the Bureau of Ships, is responsible for designing those catapults, and they decided that the nuclear plant that the Navy would provide, the nuclear plant, would not provide enough steam for the catapult, and they just put the thumbs down on designing a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, and that job didn't go ahead. However, within the same month, the Atomic Energy Commission received a suggestion from a power company south of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, the Duquesne Power Company, who was offering land and offering money to build a civilian electric power plant in the state of Pennsylvania. And the AEC suggested that we take our design for what we called the surface ship reactor and convert that to a civilian power plant, which we did, and Westinghouse did the design work, and we built the first civilian nuclear power plant in Shippingport, Pennsylvania. It went on the line in 1957. So we actually were able to save that reactor design effort that the Navy didn't want for the surface ship and put it into a civilian power plant. Subsequently, about 2 years later, Bureau of Aeronautics continued to develop steam catapults, and they didn't need as much steam. So ultimately, we did get to design surface ships. We designed the Enterprise, was the first nuclear-powered carrier. That ship was launched in 1960. It ran for 50 years. It was only shut down about 2012. So we got significant benefit out of applying nuclear propulsion to surface plants as well as to submarines. And today, I should mention, we just launched the Gerald Ford last October, I think, October 2017. The Gerald Ford is nuclear powered. She has a lifetime of 90 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the refueling of a conventional submarine could let the submarine on the surface run 15,000 miles. The first fueling of the Nautilus ran 60,000 miles. The second fueling ran 90,000 miles. And today, when a ship is launched with nuclear fuel, she can go 400,000 miles. Some of them can go the life of the ship, 25,000 miles. In the case of the Gerald Ford, she will be put on the ways, in the shipyard in 50 years, and she will be refueled for a second 40 years of operation. So the whole idea of refueling ships has gone by the wayside thanks to nuclear power, plus the fact that nuclear power is safe, and we haven't had a nuclear accident. Now, beyond this, beyond the Seawolf and the surface ships, Rickover's people, I think I've got, this is the second skipper in charge of the Nautilus. This is Bill Anderson, an entirely different personality from Wilkinson, a much more composed individual, a little harder to get to know. He took the Nautilus under the North Pole. We had Sputnik come across in 1957, which upset the apple cart as far as the world is concerned in terms of how much strength Russia had, and we felt that we needed some sort of a worldwide event to counter that. And Eisenhower decided that he would send the Nautilus under the ice cap in the North Pole. And Bill Anderson was in command of the Nautilus. I've got a map here, but I don't think you can see it. He took the boat to the north, to Honolulu, stocked it up. He ran up the Pacific Bering Sea. He went under the ice cap from the Pacific side, came out through the Northwest Passage, came out past Greenland, took the ship down to Portsmouth, England, and then ran her back to New York. And he had a triumphal entry of the Nautilus into New York City. And basically, in an attempt, tried to counter the effect of Sputnik. Now, following that, we designed a second class of submarines, as they call it, the Skate class, which was 4 submarines. And the Skate, I think I've got it here. No, this is the shipping port plant that I mentioned. That was the first civilian nuclear power plant. And this might be, here's the Skate. The Skate was the first Navy nuclear submarine, the first submarine, the first actual ship to surface at the North Pole. He took that ship to where he was exactly at 90 degrees north, and he surfaced that ship at the North Pole, sent some radio messages and so on. And he was the first ship to do that. We had another class of nuclear ship. This is the Triton. This was a 2-reactor ship. She broke the record. She sailed around the world submerged, completely around the world, completely submerged. And then finally, we got to, this is some of these surface ships. That's the first cruiser, the Long Beach. This is the Enterprise, the first carrier. And finally, we're getting to the Polaris boat. And I want to mention that because at the time, 1957 or so, the idea of ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads began to evolve into something practical. And the thought was that one of the best techniques for a major deterrent against aggressors to the United States would be to take a submarine, put ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads in it, and put that submarine out in the ocean where nobody knows it is, put out maybe 20 of them, and that would be a WMD that nobody else could deal with. And that's ultimately what happened. We designed the Polaris boat to take on initially, I think, here it is, 16 missiles. Now I think she might carry 24. These ships went out of Charleston, South Carolina. They went out for 3 months at a time. They sent 12 out at any time, and they were around the world in waters where nobody knows. They could communicate with Washington. They normally would only communicate Washington to the ship rather than the ship back to Washington. Those nuclear warheads were aimed at targets all the way through Russia, other places. And if the word came to let them go, they let them go, and nobody. This was far more effective than the missiles that the Army had in Nebraska and North Dakota, far more effective than the airplanes that the Air Force had carrying nuclear bombs, flying them overhead. Nobody could find these boats. Nobody knew where they were. They were a very effective WMD, and they're still in use today. They're no longer called Polaris. They're no longer called George Washington. They're Ohio class or something like that, but they're a significant deterrent. And nuclear technology has moved along to where this is really where we are today. Today, actually, I think I have a story here coming up. Here is, the Admiral continued on. He became a full Admiral. This is 1982 when Reagan was elected president, and they decided he should retire. It was quite a to-do. And ultimately, they concluded that he would retire. He retired in 1982. He died in 1985. Here's a picture of him at about that age. He actually became an Episcopalian when he married his first wife in 1933. That's the church, that's the National Church in Washington, D.C. They had a memorial ceremony there, and I think that's his gravestone in Arlington Cemetery. And I want to get beyond that. This is the Navy today. We have a total of 291 combat ships in the Navy. All the carriers and all the submarines are nuclear powered. We have 11 Nimitz-class carriers in commission. The Gerald Ford was commissioned in October 2017. She has a lifetime of 90 years. The Robert F. Kennedy is under construction as a sister ship to the Gerald Ford. And the Enterprise was decommissioned after 50 years in 2012. Submarine-wise, we have attack submarines, 40 Los Angeles-class boats, 13 Virginia-class commissioned, 28 more being built. I got the word from Electric Boat on this just the other day. And the ballistic missile submarines, we have something like 18 in commission, Ohio-class, and 12, the new class is the Columbia-class, 12 is being built. So the operating Navy is pretty completely thoroughly nuclear. And it'll be that way from here on out. That's about what I have to say, if anybody has any questions. If there are any questions, you'll have to raise your hand and stand up. I can't quite see. There's one right over here. Yeah.
What's an attack submarine versus a ballistic missile submarine?
Say again?
What's the attack submarine versus a ballistic missile?
It has to do with the question is, what is the attack submarine? How does it differ from the ballistic? The attack submarine is designed to track the enemy, harass them, and attack them with torpedoes or whatever weapon we have today that's currently in use. The ballistic submarine carries anywhere from 16 to 24 nuclear missiles with nuclear warheads, goes out there and sits there and waits for a signal to shoot off those missiles. So it really carries the missiles out there and acts as a WMD somewheres around in the ocean, and comes back after 3 months, and the second crew takes over and it goes out again. So the attack boat is more of a coyote type, a harassing type boat, and the ballistic boat is really one that carries missiles with the intent of releasing them if necessary as a deterrent to an aggressor.
Can you mention Munson and all the things he did to provide rescue technology for submarines?
Yeah, Munson was a naval officer who, by the way, was an EDO type, an engineering duty only type. I think he was a captain. I don't know if he made admiral. He developed a technique called the Munson lung, which would allow submariners to escape from a damaged boat from a depth of maybe 300 feet. The idea would be that you would put this lung on. you would go dive under the water and go through a tube in the submarine and follow a line going up to the surface, and you would exhale as you went up and allow the pressure in your system to equalize as you went up, and to basically save yourself from suffocation or drowning in a sunken submarine. The depth was limited to maybe 300 feet, which is what a human body could take, and it was successfully used when a submarine called the Squalus sank in, I think, 1939, somewhere off the coast of Long Island or Massachusetts or somewhere like that. But Munsen's been quite well known as a man who worked essentially and effectively in providing life-saving techniques and equipment for people in the submarine service. Is there any other
Are
question?
the props all turned with electric motors?
Say again?
The props, they're turned with electric motors?
I didn't quite hear the question.
Is everything electrical? The steam is used to make electricity
Is everything
in
electrical?
the boat? Yes, the steam. The main shaft.
Oh, well, the steam, yeah. A submarine, a naval ship, is basically an electrical goddamn vessel. You can't, it's amazing. But the steam,
Steam turbines, right?
in the Nautilus, the steam goes two places. The steam runs turbines which run the shaft. The shaft goes through a reduction gear and runs the screw and drives the ship.
Okay, they're not
But half of the steam goes to other turbines which run generators, which generate electricity, which run all the equipment in the ship.
Okay, but they don't run with electric motors then. It's a direct drive.
Well, the Nautilus is a direct drive, but some of the later boats ran motors, ran generators that ran motors that ran the propeller. And the conversion, it's a question of how efficient are they relative to the weight of everything. That's really what the issue is here. How big and how heavy is all this equipment relative to what you get from it? And I know that the later designs, which maybe start about, let's just say 1985, they would trend toward using a generation of electricity to run a motor to run the propeller.
Yeah.
Prior to that, we used steam turbines directly to run the shaft through a reduction gear.
Okay, I see. And
The reduction gear is just a big deal. The shaft of the coming off the turbine is running very, very fast, several thousand RPM possibly, and the reduction gear just slows that down to maybe a turning speed of maybe 50 RPM, which is what the propeller needs to move the boat through the water.
how big and heavy are these power plants?
How big and heavy or what?
The power plant, the nuclear power
Well,
plant.
the whole darn boat is about 7,000 tons, and probably half of that would be the power plant. It does depend on, the French made a very small one. The whole darn weight of one of the French boats is 2,200 tons. But typically in America, I think the Nautilus was of the order of 4,500 tons, and boats today are of the order of 7,000 tons, and about half of that would be the power plant.
So they use lead then to shield the...
Well, there is lead used for some of the shielding, but that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that out, because one of the ideas in designing and laying out the equipment in a nuclear boat is to use the equipment itself as part of the shield. And an awful lot of the way that equipment is placed in the reactor room is such that it shields people who are walking around that reactor. So you don't want to go in that reactor room when it's operating, and you want to let it cool down when you shut down, and maybe wait 3 weeks before you go in once it is shut down to do some work in there. You can use periscopes and whatnot, but you really have lousy access to the nuclear part of the operating plant while it's operating.
As these engines get bigger, the ships get bigger, how do you deal with the heat signature? Because you must have significant heat patterns that can be detected.
Well, it could be. Now, what you do, there's actually a third system. We have let's step back a minute. The question is, what do we do with the heat that comes out of a nuclear boat? It's a valid question, and let me see if I can describe that. You've got three, I keep tripping over the wire to the damn thing. Anyway, you've got three systems. You've got the circular system that takes the heat away from the reactor, brings it to the steam generator. There's a second system in the steam generator on the second side of the steam generator where the steam is generated. And that steam goes to the turbine and runs the turbine either to generate electricity or to drive the ship. But the exhaust steam from that turbine runs through a condensing system where they use seawater to cool that steam down, turn it back into water, and pump it back in so it can be used again to make more steam. And that condensing system throws that water overboard. And that is the residual hot water left from operating this whole system. And there's a heck of a lot of dilution going on because of the quantity of water and the size of the ocean and the speed of the ship through the ocean. So there is some consideration about heat dissipation, but as far as I know, it hasn't been a problem in terms of detecting the boat. Now, the Nautilus was a very noisy submarine. I mean, you could hear the Nautilus standing at Montauk Point while she's running off of Long Island. She's very, very noisy. And ultimately, they made a great deal of effort to design that boat quieter and quieter and quieter. And today, our submarines today, our boomers, our boats that carry nuclear missiles, our boats that are attack submarines, are very quiet. And the whole technology of sonar and all this stuff has just made the system very quiet. And I'm not familiar with that enough to really speak knowledgeably about it, except to know that it's working fairly effectively. But the heat consideration was one that was given some thought at the time, and basically it's a matter of dilution. To just spread that heat out, it was low quality heat to begin with, low temperature, and to spread it out through the ocean so that it did not cause a problem in terms of detection. Is there any other questions?
I have one. Two-part question. One, in the conventional submarines, you said they could stay underwater for a limited time. Is that under power? How long could they stay underwater when they were not under power? First part of the question. And second, what do we do with our nuclear waste and how do we deal with that?
What do we do with our nuclear what?
Nuclear waste.
Oh, I'm glad you brought that one up. I can talk to that. The first one, I'm not that familiar with operations of conventional boats under attack, but they could sit there for a week, very quiet. And the air would get very humid and tepid. They could open up things like sacks of potassium hydroxide, which would absorb some of the carbon dioxide and help the breathing. But there was an issue there of about how long can a submarine stay submerged and not move and not give the crew a problem in terms of breathing and health. And maybe somebody who's been in submarines in World War II has got a better answer. But my feeling is it was of the order of 5 to 7 days. And after that, they simply had to get some air in there so they could breathe. And I really don't have, unless... Pardon?
We could, on a new battery, we could stay under 18 hours under power. But, yeah, and then we had to come up to charge. But, yeah, sitting on the bottom. 18
hours under power, but how many hours could you stay quiet?
Fortunately, I never had to have that.
Good.
Now, if it was over 5 days,
I've read books about that, and I really don't have a good number on that. But
because of the oxygen and CO2,
and you
nothing to do with the...
You did have canisters of oxygen. You could release oxygen. There was plenty of oxygen, and it was air. There was fresh air on board, so you could release and add to that. You could absorb the carbon dioxide, but ultimately there is a limit, and I can only say that I'm aware of it being maybe of the order of 5 days, maybe 7 at the most. Now, as far as nuclear waste goes, that's a very important consideration. Today, this time in the situation in the United States, as cores are spent, they are carried to Hanford, Washington, eastern Washington, which was one of the sites where nuclear bomb material was initially manufactured, and they are stored there underground. The ultimate feeling is that they should be reprocessed and recycled. There was a discussion about that. There was a plant in Nevada that was supposed to take them for a while and hold them for recycling, but the citizens of Nevada took umbrage at that. Very little of a nuclear core, as it's called, is used up at the end of a reactor's lifetime, and an awful lot of it can be recycled. Now, the French are doing a good job of this. The French have something like 75% of the electric power generated in France is from nuclear. Most of the rest is from hydro. And the French recycle the cores of their reactors in a plant in Normandy, of all places. And it can be done chemically. I'm a little bit familiar with the chemical involvement, but people in this country haven't really gotten too excited about that. The Atomic Energy Commission ducked that issue initially. The Atomic Energy Commission is no longer around under that name, but it's still around under the Department of Energy. It went through a group called ERDA, and then it ultimately became the DOE, the Department of Energy. And a primary objective, a primary job of the Department of Energy today is to monitor and survey and see to it that our nuclear bombs are maintained and properly taken care of, and that research continues in the development of technology associated with the bombs and with the recycling of fuel from operations from nuclear plants in the Navy. So there is some work going on. It may be classified. I haven't really made much of an effort to get into it in detail. I do know that the French have been successful, and sooner or later we may solve that problem. But in the meantime, they are just being stored there in this big desert wasteland in Washington State for God knows how long. So it's an issue. It's an issue we've got to contend with. But we have a lot of other issues like that, abortion, things like this that you just never get solved. So, I mean, it's got to be solved sooner or later, but it's an issue. Have we got some other ones?